Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing those stories. They were absolutely brilliant. So this is the second talk in a 5-part series on the prophet Elijah in the books of 1 and 2 Kings. Now, the books of 1 and 2 Kings, they were originally a unified book story that continued the narrative from 1 and 2 Samuel, where we see King David successfully bring together the 12 tribes of Israel into one kingdom. We also see David receive a promise that from his line would emerge a messianic king who will establish God's kingdom and fulfill the Abrahamic promises, something that has been longed for by the people for a very long time. However, what we see straight after this is that the kings who follow David are absolutely useless. They never live up to this great standard. Instead, they run Israel right into the ground. So 1 Kings begins with David handing over Solomon, where he calls him to remain faithful to the covenant and to the commands of God. And Solomon, he does okay for a bit. He's got some good wisdom. He builds the kingdom, he builds the Jerusalem temple. But by chapter 11, Solomon is off all over the place. He's marrying daughters of kings from other nations to build political alliances. He adopts their gods and introduces their worship into Israel. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, then takes charge after Solomon, and goodness sake, he's even worse. Onto the scene comes a man named Jeroboam, who came all the way from Egypt going, I could see how this could work out for myself. This is an opportunity to grip power. And so he takes some power. There's something of a civil war that takes place. And then the northern tribes separate from the southern tribes. And so the united kingdom that David has just brought together is suddenly separated. And we've got 2 kingdoms. So the southern kingdom is called Judah, and its capital is Jerusalem. And all the kings there do follow in David's line, his lineage. And then the northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will eventually be called Samaria, they do not follow the same line. They sort of fight and fight and fight to find who the next king will be. And so in the northern kingdom, they erect 2 brand new temples in competition to the original temple in Jerusalem. They put 2 golden calves in each of these temples, which is a bit of a throwback to Israel's history. And so when you read in the Gospels and you hear about the Good Samaritan, or you hear about the Samaritan woman at the well, and you get the sense that the crowd or the disciples are feeling a little bit frosty to people from Samaria, this is the backstory. This is the history. It is centuries-old resentment that starts here. Anyway, into this scene brings a new set of characters, the prophets. And so the first that we're looking at is Elijah, who's obviously the subject of this series. A little bit after that comes the prophet Elisha, who's his protege. We might touch on him in the final talk in this series. And all of the prophets, because there are others, interact with the kings from the 2 kingdoms as we work our way through 1 and 2 Kings. So there are about 20 kings in the northern kingdom, about 20 kings in the southern kingdom, and the vast majority of them are absolutely awful. So in the northern kingdom, there are 0 good kings. None of them are good. And then in the southern king, there's about 8 out of 20, which might sort of fulfill the criteria for what a good king is based on 1 Kings. So, and this basis is this. A good king would worship the God of Israel alone. They would rid the nation of idolatry, and they were faithful to the covenant of David. And so Elijah arrives on the scene, and he meets the king of Israel, a man named King Ahab. And as Dream said in her talk last week, Ahab was just about as bad as any king had came. So 1 Kings 16 says this, Ahab did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, that's idolatry, but he also married Jezebel, who was a high priestess in the temple of Baal, which meant that he began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar to Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole, that's worshiping another god from another nation. It's a Canaanite god. And he did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. So all in all, a very bad king. He's not worshipped God of Israel alone. He's incorporated the worship of other nations. He's not rid the nation of idolatry. Instead, he's erected statues into the temples that he built and led the whole nation astray into thinking that they can worship Baal on a Monday, Asherah on Tuesdays, and then worship the God of Israel on the Sabbath. He is not being faithful to the commandments as David was, a man after God's own heart who, let's be honest, had his own sort of fair share of moral failings and misgivings. But what David did is he repented. He returned to the Lord time and time again. Ahab is not like this. And so as we heard last week, Elijah confronts Ahab and says, hey, listen, Ahab, Because of your sin, there will be no rain, no dew falling on the land at all. That's obviously going to be very bad for your economy, very bad for your crops, very bad for your people, and very bad for you. And then Elijah then goes into the wilderness following the word of the Lord, where he stays for 3 years, and he's provided for in various ways. And our reading today continues the story with the word of the Lord coming to Elijah and saying, hey, Elijah, it's now time to go back to Ahab to say the rain is coming. And so Elijah, he goes to Ahab, and what he does is he basically turns a typical pagan sacrifice for rain into a contest. He challenges the prophets of Baal because he wants to prove who the true God is. And truthfully, that's exactly what he's been doing ever since he stopped the rain. So just for a little bit of context before we read this story, Baal, which is the god we're talking about, is the agricultural god of fertility. In other words, he brings the rain on the crops. Being a rain god, his voice is thunder, his weapons are lightning. And he's represented to the people as a bull. That's his sacred animal. And his home was Mount Carmel, where they'd already built an altar to him. And so Elijah says to Ahab, listen, I want you to gather all the people of Israel for this contest. Just bring them up to the top of the mountain where that altar is. I want them all to see it. Bring 450 prophets of Baal with you. Oh, and bring 400 prophets of Asherah as well, just for good measure. And this is where we start our reading in verse 20. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel, Baal's mountain. Elijah went before the people and said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. But the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us, Baal's animal, and let the prophets choose one of them for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it onto the wood, but do not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull, put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers with fire. He is God. Fire from heaven, lightning, Baal's weapon. You see that Elijah is stacking the deck against himself. This is basically the God of Israel at an away match using the away God's weapons on the away God's mountain on his particular animal. But what's really happening is he's setting up Baal to win. It's like he's setting up Baal to win. This whole contest is for rain. Well, hey, this is your rain god on his mountain with his weapon, with his particular animal. You believe this works, make it work. Bring the rain. So the people say, yeah, sounds good to us. What you say is good. Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called the name of Baal from morning until noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. And so they shouted louder. They slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time of the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, come here to me. They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. Do it again, he said, and they did it again. Do it a 3rd time, he ordered, and they did it a 3rd time. And the water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. Just before I continue, some people think that what's happening here is Elijah's making it harder for himself, making it harder for this particular miracle to happen. I'm not quite sure that's accurate. I mean, if you are going to call down fire from heaven to hit an exact spot on the top of a mountain to devour the sacrifice and everything on it, you don't need to make it damp to make it impressive. You just don't, do you? It's already going to be a really cool sight to see. I think this is actually more likely an allusion to the Festival of Tabernacles, which has got 2 roles. One, to remember the time that the Israelites Israelites spent in the wilderness following their exodus from Egypt, but also to pray for their harvest, to pray for their agricultural life and ask God to bless it. And part of the Feast of Tabernacles includes a ritual where they poured water on the altar in the temple, asking God for rain. And so I think what Elijah's doing is he's Judaizing this particular pagan sacrifice. So he has water poured on it, pours it on 3 times. Not quite sure exactly why, possibly because they had 3 years of drought, but I can't prove that. Verse 36, at the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that these people will know that you are Lord, that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. It's a good story. Now, I'm sure it's obvious to all of us, but I think that the key verse that really is the key for understanding this particular story is when Elijah asks the people, how long will you waver between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, then follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. This is about rain, but for Elijah and for all prophets, it's always about calling the people of God back to the worship of the one true God. And so what Elijah is doing in this whole story is he's confronting the people, he's confronting Ahab, but he's confronting the people saying, how long are you going to sit on the fence? How long are you going to keep worshiping other things rather than the one true God? For Elijah, the covenant is really simple. You're either following it or you're not. You're either following God or you're not. This is true. Ahab has basically left the covenant and he's taken the people with him. He's saying, well, we'll do this on this day, and we'll do this on the Sabbath. But it doesn't work that way. The covenant is this, and you've walked away from it. And so Elijah is making an absolute claim about God. He's saying there is one true God, and we have to test which the right one is. Now, I think that we live in a society quite similar to that of Elijah in this regard. I mean, there will be times in particularly this nation's history where there would be more uniformity in sort of religious belief. But we live in a city where multiple formal religions coexist alongside one another. And in addition to sort of traditional religions, there's been the rise, particularly, it's almost like a resurgence among Generation Z, to sort of be interested in pagan New Age spiritualities, tarot readings, manifesting, crystals, other things like that. The problem is, how do we decide which God is true? How do we decide which is the right God among many? Now, I'm sure that there'll be many people in this city, possibly in this room as well, who might ask the question in response, but why do we need to decide? Why do we need to decide which is the right one? Aren't they all just fundamentally the same? Aren't they sort of like similarly valid? Can't I have like the best of this one and the best of that one? Or perhaps even more common in this city would be to claim some sort of neutrality about it. I don't really subscribe to any of them, but I can see that there's definitely some truth in this one and some truth in that one. Maybe there's some truth in all of them. So my first degree before when I was an undergrad was Abrahamic religions, where I studied interfaith dialogue between the 3 main great monotheistic religions. And fundamentally, studying that along Muslims, Christians, and Jews is the realization that all those 3 faiths are fundamentally different. They're not the same. They make different claims. And to say that all religions are just the same or just sort of different pathways is really disingenuous. And it really fails to listen to these faiths describe and talk about themselves in their own terms. Nevertheless, despite that, you may have heard people speak about, all religions are valid. They're all going to the same place. They all sort of cover the same broad ethics or something like that. And when people speak in this particular way about religions, about faith and spiritualities, often they use this example of a mountain. They talk about there's a mountain and there's a path going up the side, and there's one group of people walking up that particular path trying to get to the top. But what they don't know is that on the other side of the mountain is another group of people, and they're also walking up the path, and they're shouting at the other group saying, you're on the wrong path, you're on the path of destruction, this is the right path, this is the right path. And so there is this sort of lovely sort of idea that, many paths, one destination. I get stuff like this on my Instagram feed all the time with really sort of kooky images. I might include them in the next time I do this talk. And obviously it's a nice idea, one path, many paths, one destination. It's a nice idea. It's a very good way if you just want to stay seated on the fence. But there is a problem with it. And the problem is that the only way that you could know that all religions go to the same place is if you can see the whole mountain. When we make claims like that, when we make claims that actually all religions are valid, they've all got something to say in this regard, what we are doing is we are assuming ultimate knowledge that we assume nobody else can claim to have themselves. So to say that no one holds the whole truth is to suggest that you hold the whole truth because you couldn't know they don't hold the whole truth unless you held the whole truth. Does that make sense? And so in our reading, Elijah is an absolutist. He says, why do you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, then follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him. And so he sets up a contest to demonstrate who the true God is. Elijah believes there is one God worthy of praise. Why? Well, we don't get much of his backstory. He sort of just appears on the scene suddenly, as Dream showed last week. But right away, he shows a real understanding of the Torah. He shows really understanding of the scripture in the way that he tells Ahab what's going to happen based on what is written in Deuteronomy. So he's got this understanding of God through the scripture. But also, God provides in miraculous ways for him so many times in the chapter from last week that you just assume that he's got some expectation that God's done that before. And so I think Elijah's got some experience of what God is like. And so he says, you've got to worship the one true God. He is a prophet who's calling the people of God to come back to the worship of the one true God. He's waiting with anticipation for God to send this messianic king who will bring order to all of these things. And he's determined to bring the people back into this as well, to share in this anticipation. And of course, as we know, this is culminated in the person of Jesus, who we've spoken about already. And this is, in my opinion, the unparalleled Christian claim that God has made himself known in the person of Jesus. It's unparalleled. There's nothing like it. In this sense, Christianity is not like any other religion at all. It's not a religion. It's just not a religion. In religions, it's always about what we are doing in order to make our way closer to God. Christianity is very much the story that God has done everything necessary and drawn near to us first. Everything else is just in response. There's no need for slashing of swords or dancing in the way that the people were doing in this story. Jesus is God's Messiah. He's the one who saves. And so the claim goes, the incredible teaching of Jesus, love your neighbor, his ethics, turn the other cheek, that Jesus perfectly lived out all the way through his life, the miracles that he performed in his life are only explained and make sense if he is in fact God, that he is God who has revealed himself in the person of Jesus. And so when it comes to religious leaders, past, present, or future, nobody outclaims Jesus. Jesus claims to be one with God in word and deed. He says things like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. He says things like, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even though they live, will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing me will never die. These are bold claims for somebody to make. Very bold claims to make, particularly in a Jewish context that Jesus was in. And they can only be received or discarded on the basis of whether Jesus was raised from the dead 3 days after being crucified. Why? Why is that true? Because actually, if this happened, if somebody was raised from the dead 3 days after being crucified, we would actually have to listen to everything that he had said in anticipation of that moment. And of course, if that didn't happen at all, then we can really quite easily disregard and just say, well, he was a good guy with some nice teaching and perhaps did some impressive things along the way, but he certainly wasn't God if he died like that. One Christian writer said, if Jesus rose from the dead, then you have to accept all he said. If he didn't rise from the dead, then why worry about anything that he said? The issue on which everything hangs is not on whether you like his teaching, but whether or not he rose from the dead. Now, a lot of people do struggle with Jesus being crucified and resurrected because, well, dead men don't rise. Dead men don't rise, do they? And so people like to say, isn't this just like a myth? Isn't this just like a really nice metaphor? It's obviously a lovely idea, but why do we have to go the whole hog and actually believe this thing actually happened? And when we're in there asking those questions, we're really back on the mountain all over again. We're back on the mountain. So if I talk about how I believe in the resurrection, I believe in the resurrection. I believe it happened in history. And then somebody comes along and they say, well, actually, I don't really believe in miracles. I'm not really sure the miracle that this particular resurrection happened. It can quite quickly feel as though I've taken this massive leap of faith, but that person is standing on firm ground. But of course, the problem is, it's not true. Every single thing in this case is a leap of faith as well. If one person says, I believe in the resurrection, another person says, I don't believe in miracles, I don't believe in the resurrection, they do so assuming that they are standing on firm ground, speaking from objective rationalism. But every denial is its own form of belief. It's just trust in something else. And so the dominant worldview that all of us were sort of born into and entrenched in and often espoused without even realizing is this sense that you really can't believe that stuff because all we have access to is what we have access to by our five senses. All we have is what we can scientifically measure and what we can empirically evaluate. And that's the worldview we have. And actually, it's just another worldview as the resurrection is its worldview as well. And so the secular worldview is all we have is this. All we have is what's in front of us, what we can touch, everything that's within our ordinary experience. So the classic modern logic would be, I haven't seen somebody raised from the dead, therefore people aren't raised from the dead. We haven't seen it happen, therefore it can't happen. What it does is it reduces reality of that which we can conceive of. So it takes the human brain, it takes consciousness, and it elevates it to the highest point of knowledge, awareness, and understanding. And this particular worldview is just 200 years old. It appeared during the Enlightenment, the birth of modern science, and most of us were enculturated and socialized into this worldview. Nevertheless, this particular view is just one leap of faith among many. Let me explain why. Why this is just one leap of faith, and let me give you 3 reasons why I'm convinced by the resurrection of Jesus. So, first one, Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, the second half of the Bible, he went around starting churches all around the area, and he wrote letters to these churches after he had left them. He writes this letter to the church in Corinth. It says this. This is 1 Corinthians 15. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel which I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12, so he appeared to the disciples. After that, he appeared to more than 500 Christian brothers and sisters at that time, most of whom, are still living, even though some have fallen asleep. In other words, they died. Then he appeared to James, then he appeared to the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also. So, only a few years after the resurrection, Paul is starting these churches and he's writing to them, and his understanding of the resurrection is not only did this happen in history, not only is this a historical event, he essentially says to this church, if you're struggling to believe that thing I taught you, why don't you just go and ask so-and-so from Jerusalem? Why don't you go and ask Susan from Judea? She'll tell you she was there. There are actually hundreds of people who can verify this situation that has happened. Hundreds of people who saw Jesus post-crucifixion and resurrection. And so if you're fuzzy about the facts, if you think I might just be pulling your leg, well, you can go and ask that person from over there, and they will affirm what I'm saying to you. Paul roots the credibility of insistence on not that, you've just got to have faith. You've just got to have faith. Or, if you could just believe this in your heart, then it'll be true. No. He says this happened. This happened, and it's really important that you know this. I root it in history, and other people can verify what I'm telling you. And really, this is the insistence of all the apostles in the New Testament. Not that the resurrection is just a metaphor, not the resurrection is like a nice concept or a nice idea to think about in the springtime whilst the daffodils are coming up. It's the insistence that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead, and they have witnessed something so monumental, so mind-blowing, that it has ripped apart all of the categories that they had out of the window. The earliest Christians were convinced that they had seen Jesus raised from the dead, and they go around telling people, we are witnesses. We have witnessed something so remarkable that everything has changed for us. Let me tell you about it. So that's one. One of my favorite things about the accounts of the resurrection is the insistence that women were the first witnesses to this event. So patriarchal society. It's a patriarchal society that Jesus lived in, died in, and then lived again in. And women were not considered to be credible witnesses in this world. So in a court of law, just imagine for a moment, somebody is murdered in the street, and the only person who saw it was a woman. They would not take that as a legitimate witness. So the gospel writers, they're writing their gospels in order to try and convince people about Jesus and his claims that he was resurrected from the dead. They all together say the first witness to this resurrection was a woman. Why would you include that in your gospel? Why would you include that? You know, they're either 100% culturally ignorant, absolutely clueless, which of course by reading the gospels you know they're not. Or I don't know, maybe it's just what happened. Maybe they're just writing down, this is what happened in the story. Let me tell you about it. That's two. The book of Acts that comes right after the Gospels tells the story of the early church. And in it, we see the first Christians experienced great opposition, both within their Jewish cultural context, but also from without, from the Roman Empire as well. Now, their Jewish contemporaries opposed them because they insisted that Jesus was the resurrected Messiah, the one who God had promised would come to the people through the line of David, as I mentioned earlier. And in Acts 7, one of the first Christians, Stephen, is telling the Jewish leaders that Jesus had been resurrected and that they had been complicit in his death and they were essentially missing the thing that God was doing among them. This naturally pissed them off a bit of an understatement. They dragged him out into the street to stone him. And here's a couple of interesting phrases he said as he's dying. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." Then he fell on his knees and cried out, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." Then he said this. When he said this, he fell asleep, which again, it means he died. So, really short time span between two things. Jesus is this traveling teacher who performs miracles and stuns people and gathers a great crowd. And then suddenly, a group of people understand him from a Jewish heritage where there is one God who forgives sins and can receive people's spirit, that Jesus is the one who can do these things. So there was a widely held view in the first century among the Jewish belief that God will resurrect his people, that he would resurrect all his people at the end of time. All those people who have died would be resurrected. They would enter Jerusalem, the new heaven and the new earth. But the first Christians believed that this massive future event that God will one day take place had actually been preceded by one person, that Jesus had been raised by God ahead of time. And that Jesus was so divine, he was actually capable of receiving one's spirit when they died, but more importantly, able to grant the forgiveness of sins. Jesus can be trusted for the forgiveness of sins because he's been resurrected ahead of the great resurrection. Any good Jewish person would know that someone receiving their spirit or forgiven is exclusively the work of God. So, how did people rooted in one particular understanding of the world, the future resurrection, suddenly shift and change their minds and have a completely different belief in such a short space of time? Sociologists and historians point out that over history, when a large group of people change their beliefs and convictions, that it just takes many, 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 many years, and many conversations and dialogues and events for people to change their mind drastically from one thing to another, to have one perspective and then a new perspective. This is basic cultural anthropology. They say large groups of people never change from this to that overnight. It just does not happen unless some event has taken place and been witnessed by a large crowd who simply cannot deny what they have seen. That causes them to change their worldview and their mindset. They move from one held belief to another held belief almost instantaneously. This just does not happen in human history unless there is an event that convinces people otherwise. And we have to remember, of course, that this new belief didn't do the new believers like Stephen many favors at all. They were persecuted and killed for this new belief. This new belief that Jesus has in fact been resurrected from the dead 3 days after he was crucified. So yeah, we could go, resurrection. Come on. It's 2022, we don't have to believe in the resurrection. I only believe what I see in front of me. But of course, the problem is, if we're honest, we don't actually just believe what's in front of us. And if we did want to do that, we'd then have to try and explain what's going on in 1 Corinthians 15. Why does Paul bank on all these people who actually witnessed this thing as happening? 500 people who saw it, many of them still being alive and able to verify what he's saying. How do we explain the women dimension? Why do the gospel writers insist that the women saw an open tomb in a culture that really wouldn't have considered their testimony legitimate unless it had some sort of truth to it? And what about the fact that people who didn't believe something were willing to change their mind, and very shortly after the event, this just doesn't happen? How do we deal with those three questions? Yeah, sure, how could you possibly believe in the resurrection? But of course, to deny it raises a whole set of new questions that need answers. If you're finding this interesting, the life course that John mentioned, we discuss these questions in groups, like-minded people. I recommend it. You'll enjoy it. And we can cover more than what I can do in this short talk. So, Elijah asks the people, why do you waver between two opinions? Let's put our gods to the test. Why do we put our gods to the test? Because our gods make exclusive claims. And while they could both be wrong, they couldn't both be right. But for Elijah, the next question is, how do we test who the true God is? And for Elijah, there's only one answer, and that's with fire. We need a lightning bolt moment to go with our intellectual reasons. Sometimes we need the fire. Sometimes we need an experience. And so since the resurrection, we have 2,000 years worth of stories which point to the power of the resurrected Jesus being at work in the world, starting the book of Acts, then the early church fathers, all the way through church history, including the stories that we've heard this morning. Thank you once again, those of you who shared it. Let me add mine to those. My friend Christina, who was part of this church many years ago, she was a student with me studying law, had a problem with her heart. The valves in her heart were too small, and that meant that her heart wasn't pumping blood around her body, which meant that she was having these fits, what looked like fits because there wasn't enough blood and therefore not enough oxygen going around her body. She went to the doctors regularly. Eventually, she was put on the emergency heart transplant list because the current heart just simply wasn't working. A few of my friends prayed with her down in that spot there. We'd prayed for her a number of times over a number of years, but on this particular time, they prayed for her. They prayed in the name of the resurrected Jesus that she'd be healed, and she wondered maybe this is the case. And so as was her routine, she would go to the hospital on the Monday, as she did every single week. She received a scan which showed that the valves in her heart had grown to the proper size. Her heart was working perfectly. She was taken off the emergency heart transplant list, and she was fine. Now, Christina moved back to Sri Lanka. That's her heritage country. And my wife and I, we went on holiday to Sri Lanka about 3 years ago, just before the pandemic took place. Pip never knew Christina because she joined the church after Christina had left, but she'd heard me and others talk about this story. We went for dinner with Christina, and Christina said, yeah, everything you've heard is true. My heart is absolutely fine. I've never experienced those things ever since. I was healed in that moment. 10 years. Another story, my friend Joel, who led worship here, he's a teacher and is a worship leader. He shared this amazing story of going to do some sort of mystery work among an Aboriginal community in Australia, which is where he's from. And he had this prophetic word, a sort of a sense that God wanted to heal somebody with a problem with their finger. And this person comes forward and says, I've got a problem with my finger. And he goes, okay, do you want to hold your hands out? He holds the hand out and his ring finger in his left hand is missing. And Joel's like going, okay. I was hoping for like a bruise, but okay, we'll go for it. He puts his hand over his hands and he says, in the name of the resurrected Jesus, I pray that your hand would be healed. And he felt underneath his hand the finger grow out from where it was. And when he took his hand away, the finger was there looking like it had brand new skin. He said it was the most disgusting thing he's ever seen, but it was amazing. Joel went back a year later to see this community. And actually, the biggest story is that particular man came up to him and said that the truth is I'd actually been very abusive, violently with my wife for a long time. But actually, when I was healed, I put my ring finger back onto my ring. I put my ring back onto my ring finger. And I went and I reconciled with my wife. And all of the hatred and the anger that I had has now fallen away. If these accounts are true, they provide further compelling evidence that Jesus is alive, that he is continuing to do miracles through his people. And so in the reading, the people, they were astounded by what they saw. They saw the power of the Lord and they declared that he is God. Peter, do you want to come up? I think that there are several ways that we could respond to what we've been hearing today. And I think that for some of us, the invitation today is to turn back to Jesus. We have been wavering between two opinions. We've turned up to church on Sundays, but actually God has not been the center of our lives at other times. It might mean that we've engaged in other spiritual things. It doesn't necessarily have to. It might just mean that we have wavered between being a Christian here, but actually a general sense of neutrality about the whole thing. The invitation is to turn to God, to acknowledge him as Lord and receive his love and forgiveness. And secondly, I think there are people here who need the fire. They need to invite God to show him and his power to them, to reveal that he is present with them. Okay, let's stand.